The state highway crew had been on Seneca Creek Road for 3 days when Gene Musselman pulled his pickup to the gravel shoulder and looked down into the gorge. 60 feet below the road grade, a Manitowoc 4600 lattice boom crawler sat wedged against the shale wall at a 40-degree angle, its 80-foot boom folded against the rock face, its tracks hanging over open air on the downhill side. The crane weighed 310,000 pounds. 2 inches of rain had fallen the night it slid off the cut slope behind the bridge abutment, and the operator had made it out, but the crane had kept going. It was June of 1999, 5 weeks into a state bridge replacement project, and the Manitowoc was worth $380,000. Dale Strickland, project manager for the West Virginia Division of Highways, had brought in a Grove RT-890 rough-terrain crane from the district yard the morning after. A $310,000 machine, 90-ton capacity. He watched its outriggers sink 4 inches into the road shoulder in the first 30 seconds. The base was still saturated from the rain, and the cut slope above the gorge was clay all the way down. He called a heavy recovery company out of Roanoke, Virginia. A $460,000 Rotator wrecker, a crew in matching shirts, a driver who walked the access road, looked at the grade, looked at the gorge width, and drove home without rigging a single cable. That was Friday. If you appreciate stories about old iron and the men who keep it running, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read everyone. It was Monday morning when Gene heard tires on his gravel lane. He had already been up 2 hours feeding cattle, and he came out of the barn to see a state truck he didn't recognize parked near the gate. He didn't go over right away. He went back in, finished the feeding, washed his hands at the utility sink, and then walked out to see what the man wanted. The truck belonged to Strickland's assistant, who had driven out personally after Gene's call to the district office on Saturday evening. Gene had left his name and his number and said he thought he knew a way to get the crane out. Strickland had called Gene at 6 Monday morning, skeptical and short on words. "Mr. Musselman, we've had 2 professional recovery operations out here, a modern rotator wrecker and a 90-ton crane. Neither one could work the approach. I don't see how a 50-year-old truck changes that." Gene told him about the Forest Service road on the east side of the drainage. Told him the ground down, there was shale, not clay. Said he wasn't asking Strickland to be responsible for anything, just to walk the approach before somebody called a helicopter crane outfit from Charleston at $14,000 a day. There was a pause on the line. "Come out and show me," Strickland said. "Let me tell you about Gene Musselman, because the machine doesn't make sense without the man behind it." Gene was 74 years old and had spent 40 years running equipment for the West Virginia Division of Highways out of the Pendleton County Garage in Franklin. Motor graders, scrapers, bulldozers, cranes, compactors. He'd worked slide removals on the back roads above Spruce Knob, where you didn't have room to turn around and the drop was 200 feet off the shoulder. He'd worked 3 consecutive winters where the passes stayed closed for a week at a time and worked every flood cleanup in the county from 1962 to 1989. He knew the ground in Pendleton County the way a man knows his own house in the dark. He retired in 1989, collected his pension, and came home to the 60 acres his family had farmed since 1911. His father, Carl Musselman, had worked county road before him, starting with horse-drawn equipment in the 1930s and moving to motorized graders when the county got its first one in 1938. After the war, Carl went to the state equipment auction in Elkins and bought a surplus Federal 606 truck chassis. Paid $1,800 for it in 1951. The Federal Truck Corporation had been building heavy commercial and military trucks since 1910, and the 606 was built for the kind of work that broke lesser equipment. Straight 6 diesel, dual rear axles, frame rails you could stand on without concern. Carl took the chassis to a machine shop in Petersburg and had them fabricate a wrecker boom from his own design. Fixed vertical tower, 22 feet, built from structural steel channel and angle iron. The winch mounted low on the frame. A worm drive drum driven off the transmission through a reduction gear, so extreme that the cable moved about 8 feet per minute under full load, but pulled with a force out of proportion to anything the truck weighed. Carl used the Federal through the 1950s and into the 1960s, mostly for road crew recovery work in Pendleton County. Equipment that went off a bank. graders buried to the axles after a washout. He never charged the county and never advertised. If a man had no other option, Carl came. When Carl died in 1973, Gene got the farm and the federal both. Gene had kept the wrecker running the same way Carl kept it, the same way any man maintains a machine he intends to use again. New fuel lines in 1981. Rebuild injection pump in 1987. Recabled winch in 1994 when the original wire showed fraying he didn't like. The engine had never been apart. Gene saw no reason to open up something that ran, and it ran. By 1999, the Federal had been sitting in Gene's equipment shed for 4 years, started monthly to keep the drivetrain from seizing, driven to the end of the farm road and back. He was 74 years old and not looking for work. He was looking at a problem. Strickland was already at the road closure when Gene arrived Monday morning, standing at the guardrail with 2 engineers from the district office and a man from the bridge contractor who had the look of someone who'd been answering the same phone calls for 3 straight days. Gene climbed out of his pickup and shook Strickland's hand. Strickland was maybe 42, safety vest, clipboard, a radio clipped to his belt. He looked past Gene at the road. "Where's your wrecker?" "Still at the farm," Gene said. "No sense bringing it until we walk the east approach together." The 2 engineers exchanged a glance. They walked the old Forest Service road east for a quarter mile to where it dropped off the ridge. The road had been cut for a timber operation in the early 1960s, following the natural grade down to the creek bottom, shale outcrops on both sides. The surface was overgrown with saplings and blackberry cane, but the base underneath was still hard. Gene walked it toe first, feeling the ground. It didn't give. Strickland followed. The engineers came behind. At the creek bottom, Gene could see the Manitowoc through the sycamores, about 200 yards upstream. From down here, the angle was different than it looked from the road above. The crane had come to rest with its counterweight against the shale wall and its tracks suspended over a ledge 4 feet above the creek bed. The boom was folded, not broken. The cab glass was intact. The machine was resting, not destroyed. The younger engineer, the one with the yellow hard hat and the clipboard, came up alongside Gene. "Sir, even if you get your wrecker down that road, I don't see how you establish a pull without pushing the crane further over the ledge. The counterweight is the only thing holding it right now. Any lateral force from below, and it goes completely." Gene watched the crane for a moment. "You're thinking about pulling it sideways," Gene said. "I'm not pulling it sideways. I'm pulling the boom. Crane's resting on its counterweight. The boom is the free end. Pull the boom back toward the wall. It pivots the tracks onto the solid ledge. Once the tracks find ground, she's stable enough to self-recover under her own power." The engineer started to say something about load angles and the limits of what a 50-year-old wrecker could produce against 310,000 pounds of crawler crane. Gene was already walking back upstream toward the logging road. Strickland caught up at the bend. "You're serious?" Gene glanced back at the Manitowoc through the trees. "That's a good crane. Be ashamed to write it off when sitting right there." Strickland rubbed the back of his neck. "Mr. Musselman, if your rigging shifts that crane wrong and it goes over the ledge, I'm filing a federal incident report on top of a $380,000 total loss." "If you do nothing," Gene said, "you're paying Charleston helicopter rates until they can mobilize, and this road stays closed." He let sit. Strickland looked at his engineers. Then he looked at Gene. "Go get your wrecker," he said. Gene drove back to the farm and took the Federal out of the equipment shed. He checked the worm gear oil bath first, the way Carl had taught him, not because it ever ran low, but because checking it was how you started. Then he ran the cable through his hands from drum to hook at walking speed, feeling for any flat spot or kink that hadn't been there a month ago. He started the engine and sat in the cab while it warmed up, which took about 10 minutes. The Federal Straight 6 diesel had a sound you felt in the floorboards before you heard it through the cab, a deep mechanical note that hadn't changed in the 48 years since Carl brought the chassis home from Elkins. Gene let it warm, then pulled out of the shed and drove the 7 miles to Seneca Creek Road at 30 miles per hour. The logging road off the east ridge dropped at about a 12% grade, 1 truck wide, and the saplings that had grown up through the old wheel ruts scraped both sides of the Federal's hood as Gene worked it down toward the creek bottom in first gear. Strickland's two engineers were waiting at the junction where the logging trace met the creek bank. Gene drove past them without stopping and parked the Federal on a flat shale bench about 180 feet downstream of the Manitowoc. He set the brake, climbed out, and began walking the cable line without speaking to anyone. If you're hooked on this story, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications. These old iron stories don't show up on the algorithm easily, and your support is what keeps them coming. Thank you. The construction crew had come down from the road to watch. A dozen men, some bridge contractor, some highway department, standing along the creek bank with their hands in their pockets. The younger engineer stood at the upstream end of the group with his clipboard against his chest. Strickland was behind him, radio in hand, watching Gene work. One of the laborers said something to the man next to him, and the man laughed. Somebody else said that thing's older than my grandfather, and 2 or 3 men smiled at that. Gene was already gone, moving downstream with a coil of Snatch block rigging over one shoulder, reading the shale wall with his eyes. The mechanical advantage he needed came from the configuration, not the weight of the truck. The Federal's worm drive winch would pull through 2 Snatch blocks anchored to shale outcroppings at angles Gene had already calculated on the drive over, which would effectively triple the pull force at the hook end. The geometry mattered more than the tonnage. He wasn't trying to lift the Manitowoc. He was rotating it, using the counterweight as the fulcrum and the boom tip as the lever arm. If the angle was right, the force required to move the crane dropped from something a helicopter crane might manage to something the Federal could sustain all day. He drove the first Snatch block anchor into a crack in the shale, wedged it, ran the cable through, set the second block on a shale ledge 15 feet upstream, and ran the cable through again. Then he waded into the knee-deep creek water, worked his way along the Manitowoc's folded boom to the structural pin connection near the boom tip, and hooked his clevis to it. He checked it twice. He waded back to shore. The younger engineer had moved closer. He was watching the rigging configuration with his pencil moving on the clipboard. Sir, a 3-to-1 mechanical advantage still leaves you short of what it takes to rotate that counterweight. 60,000 pounds on the short end of that lever. Gene looked at him. The counterweight isn't what I'm moving, Gene said. The tracks are hanging 4 feet above that ledge. I'm not fighting gravity. I'm rotating the crane until the tracks drop. The engineer looked at where Gene was pointing, then back at his clipboard. He didn't say anything, but his pencil stopped moving. Strickland walked over. He looked at the cable running from the Federal's drum through the 2 Snatch block redirects and into the creek water and up to the Manitowoc's boom. He looked at Gene. If this goes wrong, Mr. Musselman. Gene took his cap off, smoothed the brim with his thumb, and put it back on. It won't go wrong, he said. He walked to the Federal's cab and climbed in. The engineer said it loud enough for the whole crew to hear. That wrecker weighs 18,000 pounds. He said it with the finality of a man who has settled the matter and is simply waiting for the other man to figure it out. Gene engaged the PTO. The worm drive took up its load the way it always had. No surge and no jerk, just a steady increase in cable tension that you felt in the Federal's frame before you heard anything from the winch drum. The cable lifted out of the creek water in a long arc and went bar tight between the Snatch blocks. The Federal's rear axles settled half an inch into the shale as the load transferred. The engine note barely changed. The worm gear was turning at about 300 revolutions per minute on the drum shaft, cable moving at roughly 6 feet per minute, and the Federal sat on its axles and pulled. For 40 seconds, nothing moved. Then Manitowoc's boom shifted. 3 inches at the tip, swinging toward the shale wall. As the boom moved, the counterweight on the far end came down by the same ratio, and the high side tracks began to angle back toward the ledge. Slowly, 1 degree at a time. The laborer who had laughed had stopped talking. The younger engineer's clipboard was at his side. Gene held the tension constant. He didn't add throttle, didn't back off. He let the geometry work the way his father had let it work on the Route 28 grader job in 1959. Same principle, same patience. The boom continued to rotate, and with each degree the tracks came closer to the ledge below them. Strickland had walked to the edge of the shale bench and was standing with his radio hanging from one hand, not using it. At 4 minutes, the near side track touched the ledge. Gene felt it in the cable tension, a slight reduction in pull, the feeling of a load finding a new surface. He eased the throttle back a fraction and held there. The track settled onto the shale. Then it gripped. The far side track swung down and found the ledge 2 seconds later. The Manitowoc's frame groaned. A deep structural sound that came up the gorge and hit the shale walls and came back. Nobody on the creek bank moved. 6 minutes after Gene engaged the winch, both sets of tracks were on solid shale. The crane was upright, the cab level, the counterweight no longer carrying the load. The Manitowoc 4600 sat stable under its own weight for the first time since the night of the rain. Gene disengaged the PTO, set the brake, and climbed out of the Federal. He walked to the edge of the bench and looked at the crane. He did not look at the crew. The younger engineer was staring at the Manitowoc. He hadn't written anything in 6 minutes. Strickland walked over to Gene. He stood next to him and looked at the crane without speaking for a moment. Then, "How'd you know the angle would clear the tracks?" Gene watched the water moving past the Manitowoc's lower track. "My father pulled a road grader out of a creek crossing on Route 28 in 1959 the same way," Gene said. "Same geometry, smaller machine." Strickland nodded slowly. He looked at the Federal, at the Snatch blocks anchored in the shale, at the cable lying slack in the creek water. "That truck's been sitting in your shed for years?" "For years, give or take," Gene said. Strickland looked at him. "You could have called us Friday." Gene looked at the Manitowoc. "You could have asked," he said. The Manitowoc's operator, a man named Dennis Pratt, who had been on the bridge project since April, had watched the recovery from the road above. He came down the logging road on foot after the tracks found the ledge, moving fast for a man in steel-toed boots on shale. He didn't say anything when he reached the creek bank. He walked up to the Manitowoc, ran his hand along the boom, opened the cab door, and climbed in. The engine turned over on the second crank. It had been in the creek water for 4 days, and it started on the second crank. Pratt looked out the cab window at Gene. Gene nodded once. Pratt engaged the tracks and drove the Manitowoc up the logging road under its own power. Strickland stood on the shale bench and watched the crane go. He had a phone call to make to Charleston, canceling the helicopter crane mobilization that had been scheduled for Thursday. That call saved the state $42,000. He made it right there on the creek bank, standing beside the Federal, while Gene coiled his Snatch block cable 20 feet away. The younger engineer, Jeff Corbo, who had been with the district office for 6 years, walked over to Gene when Strickland stepped away. He held out his hand. Gene shook it. "I had the load calculations wrong," Corbo said. "I was treating it as a direct pull. I didn't work the rotation geometry." Gene looked at the shale where the Manitowoc had been sitting. "It's easy to miss if you're thinking about lifting," Gene said. Corbo nodded, started to say something else, then stopped. He wrote something on his clipboard instead. Strickland came back from his phone call. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded check he'd already written, made out to Gene Musselman for $500. Gene looked at it. "That's for your fuel and your time," Strickland said. Gene folded the check and handed it back. "Keep it," he said. Strickland held the check for a moment, then put it back in his pocket. He didn't argue. He understood, by then, that arguing was beside the point. The word moved through the highway district the way news moves through any closed professional community, fast and with details added and subtracted at each stop. By Wednesday, the Division of Highways district engineer in Elkins had heard the full account from Strickland's written report. He called Strickland directly. The man used a 1949 Federal to do what the Grove and the Roanoke Rotator couldn't. "That's right," Strickland said. The district engineer was quiet. "How old is the operator?" 74, Strickland said. The district engineer said, "Get him in here. I want to shake that man's hand." Gene drove to the Elkins district office on a Thursday afternoon in his pickup, not the Federal. He sat across from Harold Blevins, the district engineer, who had spent 35 years in state highway work and who had seen enough field recovery to know what was ordinary and what was not. Blevins didn't make speeches. He asked technical questions for 40 minutes about the Snatch block configuration, about the worm drive gear ratio, about how Gene had calculated the rotation angle before he ever ran the first cable. Gene answered each one directly. At the end, Blevins said, Your father designed that boom? Carl designed it, Gene said. Machine shop in Petersburg built it from Carl's drawings. Blevins looked at the window for a moment. Men like your father understood things we stopped teaching, he said. Gene didn't say anything to that. He drove home. Let me pause here and tell you something about what Carl Musselman actually built, because it deserves to be said plainly. Carl fabricated that boom in a machine shop in Petersburg in the winter of 1951 and 1952, working from his own drawings, with no engineering credentials and no manufacturer specification. He had salvaged steel from a railroad job, structural channel, and angle iron, and he had 40 years of watching how loads move and how leverage works. The boom he built was 22 feet tall and plumb to within a quarter inch when Gene checked it with a level in 1994. The welds had not cracked. The frame extensions Carl welded to distribute the winch load across the truck's rear chassis had not shifted. 48 years of weather and real work, and the boom was still square, still true, still exactly what Carl had put in place on a cold morning in early 1952. Gene had never restored it. He had maintained it, which is a different thing. A restoration makes something look like it did the day it was built. Maintenance keeps it doing what it was built to do. Gene knew the difference, and he chose accordingly. After the Seneca Creek job, Gene received 6 more calls over the next 3 years. A contractor in Grant County had a bulldozer in a strip mine pond where the banks were too soft and too steep for any recovery company in the county to anchor. A road crew in Hardy County had put a motor grader off a hillside cut in the dark. A logging operation in Randolph County had a skidder buried to the axles in a creek crossing that 4 tow companies had refused. Gene went each time. He assessed the approach, rigged the cable the way Carl had designed the winch to be rigged, and pulled the load at 6 feet per minute until the job was done. He charged for fuel. He did not charge for his time. His father hadn't, and he saw no reason to change that. Dennis Pratt, the Manitowoc operator, told the story at every job site he worked for the next 4 years. He had a particular way of telling it. He always started with the Roanoke Rotator turning around in the parking area and driving home without rigging a single cable. He always ended with the Federal sitting on that shale bench with its cable lying slack in the creek water. The job done, Gene already coiling his rigging. He said, I watched a $460,000 record decide it couldn't do the job and leave. Then I watched an 18,000-pound truck from 1949 do it in 6 minutes. He said it without embellishment, which is why people remembered it. The one thing Gene had wanted and didn't get was for Carl to have lived to see it. Carl Musselman died in 1973, 26 years before the morning on Seneca Creek, and he never saw what the Federal could do in the hands of a man who understood its geometry. Gene thought about that on the drive home that day. Carl had built the boom for hard jobs on bad ground with no room for modern equipment and no budget for modern methods. And that is exactly what the Federal had done. The man who built it wasn't there. Gene thought about that. And then he put it away, the way men put away things they can't change and have no use grieving over. Strickland filed his incident report with the division and wrote the account straight. The failed Grove RT-890, the failed Roanoke Rotator, Gene's assessment of the east approach, the Snatch block configuration, the 6-minute recovery. The report moved through the district and eventually reached the state equipment manager's office in Charleston. A copy went to the Federal Highway Administration Regional Office because the bridge project carried federal funds. Nobody in Charleston had a category for what had happened, so they filed it under successful recovery by contractor equipment, which was accurate and missed the point entirely. Harold Blevins retired in 2003. At his dinner in Elkins, he talked about 3 recoveries he had seen in 35 years that he still thought about. The Seneca Creek job was one of them. He said, a 74-year-old man with a machine his father built from salvaged steel told 2 professional recovery companies something they didn't know. He said it without any ceremony, the way you say something true that you want people to carry with them. Gene kept the Federal running until 2007, when he was 82 years old and the cold had gotten into his hands badly enough that wading a creek in June was no longer something he should be doing alone. He donated the record to the West Virginia State Farm Museum in Point Pleasant that spring, fully operational, with a folder of maintenance records going back to 1974 and a brief typed note explaining what Carl had designed and why. The museum restored the paint to the color Carl had chosen in 1952, a deep red that had faded to rust orange in Gene's shed, and put it on display in the equipment barn with a placard listing its history in the Seneca Creek recovery. They put Carl's name on the placard alongside Gene's. Gene had asked them to do that. Gene Musselman died in 2011 at the age of 86. He had outlived most of the men he'd worked alongside at the Pendleton County Garage, and he had outlived the Seneca Creek Bridge project by 12 years. The bridge was still standing when he died. The Federal 606 is still in Point Pleasant. The boom Carl fabricated from salvaged steel in 1951 and 1952 is still plumb, still square, still true. The worm drive winch still turns when a museum staff demonstrates it. That slow mechanical rotation at the drum that doesn't look like much until someone explains the gear ratio and the force it develops at the hook. Then people get quiet and look at it differently. Jeff Corbo spent 20 more years with the Division of Highways after the Seneca Creek job. He talks about it when he teaches field recovery assessment to new engineers at the district. He tells them to work the rotation geometry before they work the lifting math. He tells them that the man who pulled that crane out had been looking at that kind of ground since before most of them were born. He tells them the machine was built from salvaged steel in somebody's shop, and it outlasted every objection made on that creek bank. He lets that sit without adding to it. The diesel cooled in Gene's equipment shed that evening the way it always cooled, ticking down through the temperature range in the June dark. Gene parked the Federal back under its tarp, the same position it had occupied for 4 years. He walked back toward the house without looking back at the shed. The Federal would be there in the morning, ready for the next time someone ran out of answers. That had always been enough. Thank you for staying with this one to the end. If this story meant something to you, check out the other Iron Witnesses videos on your screen now. There's plenty more old iron with stories to tell. Subscribe if you haven't yet. I'll see you at the next one.